Hello, friends, and welcome to the February 16th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about policy issues here in our great state and have a conversation about how you can engage in that process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and we have an exciting program for you today as we welcome Grace Chimene to the program. Grace is the president of the League of Women Voters of Texas and is my favorite cheerleader for democracy. She'll talk to us about the ongoing elections and how you can participate. We'll also be joined by Cathy Morgan and Kendal Gladish with University Presbyterian Church in Austin to talk about their election protection efforts and share some ideas about what your congregation might be able to do to support democracy. And we'll introduce a new short segment with Texas Impact's Advocacy Director Josh Houston. I know you've missed him, so he's going to join us to talk about what he's watching this week in Josh's weekly watch list. But to kick us off, we'll begin with a weekly word from Reverend Matt Gaventa. Matt is the senior pastor of University Presbyterian Church in Austin, a church that's taken their responsibility to encourage voting seriously and will be highlighted later in the program. But before we get to the program, I want to share a couple of quick thoughts at the top. First, thanks to all who reached out to share your thoughts on the relaunch of Weekly Witness. It's been an exciting project, and we always love your feedback. This is another reminder that this is your podcast, and we would love to hear from you with questions or thoughts about the new format. You can reach me at scott@texasimpact.org. And help us out by subscribing, sharing, and inviting a friend to listen. But today, I want to focus on Texas primary elections, which are now underway. We've talked about it for years, and we've now covered it in 3 consecutive podcasts. Y'all, these elections are especially important. I think this is the 3rd straight podcast I've said it. But again, for emphasis, 95% of Texas elections are decided in the primaries, especially after redistricting. So if you want to have a say in who represents you for the next 2 to 4 years, now is the time. Grace will talk to us about how to find out who's on the ballot, but it's up to us to do the work. Learn the candidates and mobilize our friends to go vote. As a reminder, early voting is now underway and runs through February 25th before Election Day, March 1st. This is important. Your communities, neighbors, and democracy need you. So spend this podcast thinking about what you can do to participate and to lead, to encourage participation in this election and then again in November. So with that, here we go. Our weekly word with Reverend Matt Gaventa.
Here in Austin, we are right around the 1-year anniversary of the great winter storm of 2021, which knocked out power and water for folks all around town for days on end. My house was very fortunate. We lost neither power nor water, and we moved from the Northeast with a bit of experience driving in icy conditions, which meant that I could help. If folks in my neighborhood needed food, I could go get some. If they needed water, I might be able to find some. It wasn't much, but it felt like this is just what we do as human beings and as Christians. And if there are folks in my neighborhood or in my church that can't get what they need, I want to be able to help them do it. And I don't really think this is controversial. I think most pastors and church folks that I know would say exactly the same. But now let's change the lens just a bit. In the summer of 2020, in my congregation, we began to notice that there were members of our church who were getting worried about being able to cast their vote in the upcoming presidential election. Many of them were still in heavy COVID isolation. Many of them were worried about venturing out into the world or were living in assisted living setups where venturing out into the world would have been heavily frowned upon. So just like the storm, some of the folks in our church couldn't get what they needed. They couldn't get the information and the material they needed to be able to exercise their civic right to cast their vote, and thus to participate as Christians are called to do in the basic organizing of a society. That's when we realized that as a congregation, voting rights was a matter of pastoral care. We weren't just fighting for some abstract principle, though voting rights certainly is also that. Instead, we were fighting to make sure that we could help people have the opportunity to vote, no matter who they were voting for, because helping provide people with their basic needs and helping them exercise their basic rights is part of the work that God calls us to do. If someone is hungry and shows up at the church, we try and feed them. And if someone is thirsty, we try to find them something to drink. And if someone wants to make their voice heard in a democracy, we bring them the paperwork. It sounds like we're doing that thing that everyone worries about churches doing. It sounds like we're getting all political, and maybe we should be, but that's not what's really happening on the ground. What's really happening on the ground is that we just want to offer pastoral care to our neighbors. And sometimes that looks like a voter registration form. So I have to tell you, when the Texas legislature decided to make a stink about the accessibility of mail-in voting, when they decided to make a stink about the process that helped a lot of folks in my church vote, and the process that encouraged a lot of my folks and a lot of our neighbors to vote, when the legislature decided to pick that fight, they weren't picking a fight about the normal sorts of political issues we fight about. If helping one another fulfill our civic duty is a way that we love one another, and I think that it is, then what the legislature was really doing was picking a fight about whether or not we are even allowed to love our neighbor in the first place, about whether we are even allowed to follow the basic commandments that Jesus asks of my tradition and that form the bedrock of so many other traditions. And speaking for myself, that's just not a fight that I think we should be prepared to lose. Thanks be to God.
This week's episode of Weekly Witness was brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas and the COVID Collaborative.
I feel like our guest today needs no introduction to long-term Weekly Witness listeners. Y'all, it's election season in Texas, so that means we have with us Grace Chimene, president of the League of Women Voters of Texas, my favorite cheerleader most days for democracy in Texas. So Grace, thanks for being with us. It is election season. I'm going to avoid asking us how we're feeling today, but can you start out with just a reminder of who the League of Women Voters is? And maybe tell us, is it just for women?
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here today, too, because I just really appreciate all your work you do across the state, reaching out to communities of faith, and then by sharing election information with them, too. It's just so important. The League of Women Voters is a organization that is going to be around for 102 years. On Monday, February 14th, is the national
happy
holiday.
Birthday.
I'm going to tell you, the Texas League has been around for 103 years. So, for that. We are, our mission is empowering voters and defending democracy. But we do take action on issues. Also, we're very politically active here in Texas, but we never support or oppose political parties or political candidates. So we are open and inclusive community of people who believe in supporting our mission, and we are open to, at this moment, we're trying to change it, but 16 and over for men, women, anyone who would like to join or just support the league is much appreciated. We have about 32 active leagues in Texas in many different communities, as big as Houston and as small as Lavaca County. So if you have a group of folks who wants to start a league, let us know.
I feel like it might have been the last time you and I were together in person that we talked about the upcoming 100th birthday, but 102, an incredible amount of time doing some incredible work. So one of the questions I like to ask guests, because I think our listeners of faith are interested in this, but there are a lot of things you could be doing with your time. And I wonder why you've chosen to commit your life, your service to democracy through the League of Women Voters. Why did you choose to do this in this capacity?
Well, by trade, I'm a retired pediatric nurse practitioner, and I practiced more than 30 years doing that. But I was taking a break in 2012 when one of my neighbors hung an effigy from his tree in his front yard. Oh, wow. That was a symbolic of President Obama. And at that time, I thought that was horrible. I was awake enough to know what it meant, and I thought it was horrible, and I decided to take a stand against it. And I did talk to the media and say I didn't think that people should be using violence as a form of communication to try to get people voting in elections, because that's what he was doing. And it was a terrible time. And that's when I decided to join the League of Women Voters. So it was in 2012. I remembered my mom had been in it. And I said, well, I'm going to call a nonpartisan organization who works on voting in elections, and I am going to work with them. And then I just got into it. It was very exciting. But that one incident was why I called the League of Women Voters.
We've talked all these times, and I've never heard that story. Thanks for sharing. So we are recording this early, but as of posting, early voting is underway. So what do people need to know about these elections that are ongoing currently?
So it's the Texas primaries. Texas is different than many other states. So if you moved here, pay attention, because the Texas primaries are open. Voters in Texas don't register with a party when they register to vote. And so every time there is a primary, it's open. You can choose to vote in the Republican primary. You can choose to vote in the Democratic primary. When you vote in one of those primaries, you need to stick with that party through the election season. So this is a time when you can make a say in who's going to be running in that party in the general election. But also, don't forget this, many times this is the only opportunity you have to choose between different folks who are going to actually have that elected office, because nobody's running in the other party's position. So pay attention, choose a party, choose a ballot, and vote on the Republican ballot or vote on the Democratic ballot, and choose the best candidates.
Yeah, and so to be clear, because you said you stick with that party through the election season, you meant through the primary election season, through the runoffs.
So during the primaries, oftentimes there's like maybe 5 people running in for an office, and then the primary, if you don't get over 50% of the votes, then you have to be in a runoff. Right. And the runoff elections will be later on in the year. When you vote in the primary, that does not mean at all that you have to vote for those same people in the general election. In the general election, it's whoever you want to vote for.
Right. And, a lot of times I've been talking to some friends, because in my local community, there are several hotly contested local races on one side of the ballot, and none on the other side. And so there are a lot of people trying to figure out which primary best helps them determine who will represent them in the coming years. And so that's something important to think about.
Yeah, some people think that the governor's race is the most important, or one of these others, but oftentimes it's those local elections that really are important to voters, because they impact those voters. The decisions they make when they're in office impact those voters a lot.
So I think it's fair to say that this primary election is even more important because in a typical in a typical year, I think Josh always says that 95% of Texas legislative races are determined in the primaries because of the way the districts are drawn. And that's probably especially true this time because we just came out of a redistricting cycle, right?
Right.
So, we've talked about, kind of jumped ahead. We've talked about local races. You mentioned the governor's race. What kinds of things are on the ballot during this May election season?
So most of the time, what kind of things? It's not things that are on the ballot, or there are candidates that are running for office. And so this is your opportunity to choose those candidates either in the Republican. So what offices are on the ballot? So there's a statewide offices all the way down. State Board of Education offices are really important to many people in communities. A lot of judges are on the ballot. Then you get down to the local elections. The ones that are run in the Democrat and the Republican Party would be like your county judge or county commissioners. But I don't think some of those are not partisan elections. They're local elections, like your city council people. They're not partisan. Your school boards are not partisan, so they're not going to be on the ballot. The best way to find out who's on the ballot is go to your county election website and just download a ballot if you can. And if you have a printer, then print one up so you could just mark what you want or who you want to vote for. And you could compare candidates right now on the League's Nonpartisan Voters Guide at vote411.org, vote411.org, in order to compare those candidates either on the Republican ballot or on the Democratic ballot.
So I know I always love to hear from you. You're, like I said at the beginning, a cheerleader for democracy, a cheerleader for voting. Anything else you'd add about why this election is particularly important? And I wonder if the League has any research on what motivates voters to participate in elections.
The research that motivates voters, I think it's changing over time. So it used to be the research was, stay positive, join the party, let's go, we can do this, let's all vote. But then some folks are now starting to think talking about issues is another way to get folks to participate in the election, issues that are important to them. We tend to not do that, but many folks think that the issues are what gets people out to vote. One research that I know is important is for voters is social pressure. And so that means you tell your friends, you tell your family, you tell your coworkers, you tell your other church members that it is time to vote, and I'm voting and I want you to vote. So you need to be welcoming to everybody in your community. Reach out to everybody and make sure that they know that they should be voting. And that sort of subtle pressure is very effective.
I've said before, I'll say it again now. My Sunday school class has breakfast tacos one morning, and I'll go vote early together. So think of some fun, creative ways to encourage your friends. So Grace, it does take a little extra work to participate in primary voting, right? We don't have the usual party labels to influence who we vote for that some people use to influence who they vote for. So it does take a little more work to research the candidates. Does the League have any tools to help people make informed decisions about who's running?
Right. So vote411.org is our nonpartisan voters guide. We also, and you could go there and you put in your address and it pulls up all the candidates in your community, statewide on down. If you have a local league in that area, it pulls up all those candidates and lets you re-ask specific questions of those candidates that we think are important or that have to do with their job if they're elected into office. And then they answer in general. Most of them have been participating at a pretty high level. They answer, and then you guys get to compare those answers to the questions and try to vote for the one you think is follows your morals, your ethics, whatever you think is important.
Now I'm just curious, and just logistics and gathering those. Do your local leagues help solicit that feedback, or what's that process like?
It takes so many volunteers to do this, because we do it for the state, for all the state offices, because I'm with the state league. But then all these communities that have a local league reach out to those candidates with their questions using our Vote for 1-1 tool. And then those candidates upload the answers. And we don't change anything, almost, unless they're not allowed to talk about other candidates. They need to answer the question and not just say disparaging things about other candidates. And so we generally don't change anything on there. And so it takes a huge effort by volunteers all across Texas who are members of the league to do this. And we're just so happy that candidates across, both in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party, participate in this really important voters guide. I think we had, during the general elections, we had a million people use it. 1 million people. That's huge.
That's a lot of people.
Yeah. And some of them are using the online version at vote411.org. Some people can find the voter's guide in their community library. It's not at every library, but at libraries across Texas, we have the voter's guide available. So a printed copy of it. So, or if you have a local league of women voters, give them a call and find out where they could get a hold of a printed copy if that's how you feel more comfortable. The problem is that so many people are running. It's a large document. I feel more comfortable on using vote411.org, but some people feel more comfortable reading it in print. You could also find the printed copy on our website or your local league's website. Mine is lwvtexas.org if you want to read a PDF.
Well, I have definitely used your resources and recommend them to everyone listening. So once we've done that work, once we have encouraged our friends and shared the resource with our neighbors and encouraged them to figure out who they're voting for, do you have any other best practices or suggestions on how people can actually motivate their friends to get to the polls?
So if you're on social media, then by all means say, I voted and now you go out and vote. But just remember, voting is not just, some people tend to see it as an individual action. I voted, check, I don't have to do anything more. No, we live in a democracy. You need to really get out there and encourage everybody to vote. I think one of the messages that needs to go out to your family and friends and other folks is about open primaries. Folks do not know that they can make a huge difference by voting in the Texas primaries. Go with them to the polls, help them make a plan to vote. Making a plan to vote is often where people get stuck. They get stuck like, well, I don't really know how to do the process. Explain the process to them, tell them you'll go with them to the polls. When you show up at the polls, they're going to say, do you want to vote on the Democratic ballot or on the Republican ballot? Let me see your ID, and then sort of walk them through the process. Ask them, what day are they going to go vote? Are they going to vote early? Or are they going to vote on election day? We encourage everybody to vote early. If they're voting by mail, offer to help them because there's some issues with the new election law. And so help those folks who need help with the vote by mail application and the ballot. So please reach out to everybody and make sure that everybody knows they can vote in this election.
So speaking of the new election laws, yeah. So we all spent a lot of time last year opposing some of these, well, I'll speak for us, opposing these voter suppression efforts. Mm-hmm. And it seems like a mixed bag. Like, I don't even know if we should ask this question, but it also seems like there's important information that we need to cover. I think it's important to stress that people can still easily vote, but there are some changes that have been made that people need to be aware of. So for an ordinary voter, what's changed that people need to be paying attention to, both before they go out to the polls and and or if they're trying to vote online? What do people need to know?
So for the people who are voting by mail, there has been some major changes. For the people who are just ordinary voters who have the ballot, they can read the ballot, they don't need any help at the polls. They understand about getting to, being there on time and going through the voting process. They won't even feel a change, more than likely, at most places. Where you're going to see the issues is with vote by mail, with people who need assistance at the polls, with people who may not be able to read the ballot because of a vision issue, because of a language issue, and they need to bring an assistant to the polls. There are some issues with poll watchers having more freedom and be able to move about more. You may see a little bit of a change there. We hope it's not going to be massive. They do have to be trained now, and they do have to be certified, and they do have to take an oath that they will not try to keep anybody from voting. So those are some things we just have to be aware of. I want people to know if they have any issues at the polls that they could call election protection, and you're going to provide that number.
866-OUR vote.
There you go. 866-OUR vote. And election protection have volunteers that can help you if you have any problem with voting, either at the polls when you're voting in person or with your vote by mail ballot or anything. They'll be happy to chat with you on the phone. If you feel more comfortable texting them, you could text them. So it's a great nonpartisan organization to help out with folks. So hopefully most people won't feel an impact, but the people who do, if there's a problem, they need to give us a call. Also, you could volunteer. We're always looking for volunteers. We train them. So you can I'll go to lwvtexas.org and I'll under election protection and find out how to be trained to be an election protection volunteer, either in person or roving, where they drive around and check all the polling places and stuff. That's a really fun opportunity. It's a great short-term volunteer.
It is. And that's important. And the Texas Impact staff has all participated in that in the last year. I served as a monitor last year at a couple of different locations in my community. So definitely encourage people to consider how you can work to support the election infrastructure in this election and the next. If you feel like well, number one, it's not too late to sign up for this election. But if you need more time to prepare, if you want to organize some people from your congregation, go ahead and start doing that work now for November or May and November and future elections as well.
You could be a poll worker, an election worker, or you could be help with election protection. You could you'll be helping democracy by handing out information about the voter's guide or about voting in the election and talking to your friends. There's so many ways to help. And this is how democracy works, is everybody helps each other. And we all vote in a community and try to encourage free and fair access to democracy in your community. And if you notice something happening, please let me know, because things are happening in the community and we need to be aware of it and take it to the folks who can do something about it. Go compare candidates at the Nonpartisan Voters Guide at vote411.org. Choose the best candidate and go vote. Thank you.
Go vote. Y'all, we have our marching orders for this week. Grace, thank you so much for your work, for your time today and for your work. And I look forward to looking with you as we see all of our folks post their I voted pictures on social media.
Yay,
right?
Another social pressure. Let's do it.
Let's do it. All right, friends, go vote.
Bye-bye.
And now a new segment with an old friend, Texas Impact's Advocacy Director Josh Houston. So Josh, election season's now underway, and we've talked in the past about the energy being in the Republican primary. And one of the big items you're watching there is a significant major ad buy. So what should we be watching?
Yeah, so what I'm watching is a major ad buy that was made at the beginning of last week, and it is aimed at about 20 or 25 incumbents, attacking them for their position on a House rules vote that basically in the Texas House, the minority party has historically always had chairs of various committees. And that content is interesting because it really affects the operation of the Texas House. If you actually eliminated the minority party from any involvement whatsoever in the policy process, it would have the ironic effect if it actually did shape the processes of the Texas House of unifying the minority party that has often been able to be divided by a speaker by allowing certain members of the minority party that are willing to work with the speaker to have some sort of power and say. The timing of it is also interesting, Scott, because in the past, you used to, direct mail pieces are not new to campaigns. They're commonplace. But what is interesting is the timing of it, because historically these things would kind of trickle out bit by bit and incumbents would have time to respond. The fact that they all kind of just avalanched here the week before is interesting because it does not really give incumbents time to respond to it. In the past, this is a past example, but I know Chris Patty, who's retiring, is from East Texas. And he would take a stack of these things to different town halls and say, let me tell you who these people are that are funding this thing. They're people who want to privatize the public school system, which is 100% true. It's coming from an extreme element funding the most extreme candidates for the Texas House. And really, it's about power and control of the Texas House and controlling the operations of it.
Well, that is definitely something to watch. Thanks, Josh, and we'll see you next week. I'm now excited to bring to the program two of my favorite voting rights friends from University Presbyterian Church in Austin, Texas. We have with us Cathy Morgan. Hey, Cathy.
Hello.
And Kendal Gladish. Hey, Kendal.
Hello.
So we're going to talk some about the ministries relating to voting rights and voter information that University Presbyterian Church in Austin has been engaged in over the course of the last year. And I just have to say, University Presbyterian Church has been a great example of a church that's taken the responsibility to participate in democracy seriously. So let's start out with you just telling the listeners, what kind of things has UPC done to promote voting and voting rights?
Well, I'd be happy to take that, Scott.
Thanks, Kendal.
We have a very active social witness committee, and there's a member of the session who is chairing the committee. And for about 3 years, we've been very concerned in the state of Texas about election integrity. And it also helps that we have B. Moorhead as a fellow member. She's a font of ideas.
Right.
So social witness during the early pandemic became very committed to a program of vote by mail. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but it was very systematic. We also wanted to communicate to the community that we were entirely in favor of open access to the polls and safe access to the polls, especially in 2020. And so we had a big banner made up that says, "Let the people vote." And we have it on the outside of our church. And the wording of that is very specific. We did not want it to sound biblical. This is a very emphatically nonpartisan effort. And but we're proud to have the sign.
I love the sign. Having a chance to drive by it a couple of times, it makes me feel warm and fuzzy when I see it. So why did y'all feel, or why did the church feel that this kind of statement, that these kind of efforts were important?
I think we were aware during the pandemic and that when we didn't even have vaccinations, that older people and homebound people were not going to feel safe going to the polls or perhaps couldn't go to the polls. So our effort was focused on getting them applications to vote by mail, which was not quite as complex in 2020 as it has become. So it was really service, pastoral service, helping our seniors and our homebound members not lose the right and access to the voting booth. Even if
and I think that's important, right? We have a lot of, obviously, a lot of people of faith from many different types of faith communities who are interested in this. And you mentioned the social witness team being an important part of this process, but there are a lot of people in congregations who could be helpful with this kind of project. So in your congregation, what types of people and groups have been proponents of these kind of projects?
We had volunteers immediately, even members of the church who were not on our committee. They offered to deliver packets that we prepared for applications to vote, and we had people offer to bring the finished applications to the polls or to the county clerk. But that's not okay. If you were going to deliver them and not mail them, you had to do that in person. So I would say we had a good team of the 10 or so members of Social Witness and probably another 10 who just said, I'm not on Social Witness, but count me in. And I think it's just a reflection of a very socially engaged, concerned community. We're right on campus. We see things up close. And I think the mission of the church has always been pretty outward focused. Would you agree, Cathy?
I agree. Yeah.
So, Kendal, we'll continue because you mentioned the vote by mail program. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about what you did and maybe what you're thinking about doing moving forward. And I wonder if any of this, the responses from people in the congregation surprised you.
Yes, what we did is very specifically in the spring of 2020, got together a team. We made a list of people who were willing to serve, and we worked with our church secretary to build a list of members. And, as most churches know, they really run by the church secretary. So she produced a list of all our members over 65 or who were homebound, and it was a good-sized list. And we emailed each of those people, and then we followed up by phone. And we made packets, very simple, in a Glad bag that had the actual application, instructions for filling it out, and a self-addressed return envelope. And we did stamp it in 2020. We delivered those to anyone who asked for them. All told, we probably delivered about 70 or 80. We checked in with them and tried not to pester them, but we made sure that they could get those applications completed and in the mail or delivered. And then we tried to keep track of who we got a hold of and how they responded. In terms of surprises, we had a few members who objected to the number of calls. And I think we also did something a little bit dumb in that we had some wonderful interns helping us. And I would advise anybody who starts this, make sure the interns do things other than the follow-up phone calls, because sometimes the enthusiasm of a 20-something intern is not the same, and they don't know the people like members of the church do. So we had some complaints that they were being pestered. This year, we've really dialed it back. We have things in the newsletter, and we're not getting asked to deliver applications. It's a far more complex process, as we all know this year. So we're spot checking, and we will pivot. We're pivoting this week to more souls to the polls. We'll call people and ask them if they need a ride to get to early voting or on election day.
I remember hearing you talk previously that one of the things that surprised you was that this was completely nonpartisan.
Oh, yes.
Right.
And that was so important because I believe very firmly in the division between church and state. This was strictly a service to our seniors. And we joked because My party is fairly, I wear my party on my sleeve, but we joked a couple times when I delivered packets that, well, here's your packet. We're probably going to cancel each other's votes out. And, just
Right.
very straightforward. We didn't just deliver packets to one party or the other. It was very, very mission service focused.
Well, that's important, right? And that
Yes.
should be the role of a congregation, is to make sure that everybody is participating in democracy without regard to, who they're voting for.
Absolutely.
Well, what an incredible ministry, and I thank you for your work there, and thanks for sharing it. Cathy, I want to bring you into the conversation because this was kind of piece one that I think kind of brought the congregation into doing some of this voting work. But y'all taken it up another notch with the voter information booth near the University of Texas campus. Why don't you tell us some about maybe how that got started and what y'all did?
I believe the idea originally came from a conversation with B. Moorhead and our pastor, Matt Gaventa. And then Matt said, well, I have an idea of someone who can spearhead this. Let me check with her. And so that was me.
Nice, thanks.
Eventually, this was early on. So this was, actually, it was in the middle of September when we started putting it together. And within 2 weeks, we had teams of people to work during the month of October. Our church is located in such a position that we have a lot of students that pass by every day and right by our building. So it made sense then to set up a voter information booth there for them. If we were in a different context, then we would have set up a voter information booth according to wherever we were. I'll talk about that in a minute. But we had a lot of volunteers who ended up working with us, some who were volunteer deputy registrars and some not. So we had one VDR at each time that we were open and one not. We had takeaway pages of what's on the ballot because this was in September before the November election, and it was on propositions, state propositions. So we could give out that list with information on the League of Women Voters and how to go to vote411.org to get more information about the ballot. We also gave out candy and thinking that maybe that would help draw people. Well, I think
college kids like candy.
Well,
I hear you.
Yes, but a lot looked at it and said, well, no thanks. But I think the fact that we had something there for them along with cold bottles of water meant that we were a welcoming church and we were friendly and we could engage in nice conversation. And so that was good. We had about 260 or so students pass by stop and visit with us during that month of October. We had the volunteers on site 2 hours a day, 3 days a week, each of the weeks of October. Also, we gave out information on our church's college group, and that was nice. And one student came running up to our booth just as we were folding up, and he said, "Are y'all Presbyterian?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Oh, good. I've been looking for a Presbyterian church." And within minutes, he had met the choir director and went to choir practice that night. So you just never know. We had pages of information. We had, at that point, supplies for application for ballot by mail, and that we can no longer, well, we might be able to do. We're kind of an in-between stage. We let the students know about the votetexas.gov site where they could get all sorts of information about their ballot as well as their registration and so on. We were really impressed with one, this was by our volunteers. They were impressed with being able to really chat with students and enjoyed that, but they also enjoyed being with each other in the booth and getting to know each other. We're a destination church, so we may know people by name. We kind of know a little bit about them, but that time allows for getting to know someone better. So it was like a triple plus in terms of these. I think that I know that if churches want more information on this, particular program, they can go to Texas Impact website and find a list of kind of directions and ideas. But I think the whole idea of having a voter information booth is a good one and can be adapted to wherever you are. It doesn't necessarily mean you need to be among students. Would you like me to tell about the person I talked with from another church?
So that was going to be my next question is, you have done this in a university setting because that's where your church is, but every congregation has a different ministry context and a different setting. So y'all have been so gracious to talk to other congregations about how they can implement something similar. So yeah, absolutely. Tell us about other congregations you've had a chance to talk to and what listeners should consider in their own congregation.
This past weekend, I spoke with a woman from a church that is located more in East Austin. And she, as we began to talk, I said, well, tell me who your target group is. Who are you trying to give information to? She said, well, really, it's the people in our neighborhood. They come to our church twice a week, and we have food to hand out. And so that's a grand opportunity to have an information booth out and give them information on either registering to vote or what's coming up in terms of elections. And so it was a great conversation. I was glad to hear that people were looking at their own situation and seeing what seemed to fit best in that context. There are some other churches who are more downtown churches, and their voter information booth would vary slightly with that, depending on what their situation is in the downtown area and how much foot traffic they had.
Listeners, here's our challenge for the week is to think about what our ministry context is in our local congregations and figure out how we can make sure that our communities are informed, are educated, and are able to vote. And so, Kendal, Cathy, thank you so much for your leadership. Thanks for being willing to share your story so many times, including your time today. Thank you both for all you do.
Thank you.
I want to thank our guests today, Reverend Matt Gaventa, Grace Chimene, Josh Houston, Kendal Gladish, and Cathy Morgan. And a special thanks to Texas Impact Communication Coordinator David Vassallo for bringing his audio production talents to this new version of Weekly Witness. But I especially want to thank you for tuning in. Elections take all of us, and I don't think I need to sell our listeners of this podcast on the importance of voting, but if I do, let's chat. Scott@texasimpact.org. But I do hope we'll all spend some time today thinking about how we participate even more fully in election 2022. As a judge, as an election worker or monitor, or by doing even more to encourage our friends and families to vote. I hope that you'll step up for the primary elections. There's still time. But if you can't now, start thinking about what you will do for the May runoff elections or November general elections. Y'all, there's a lot of craziness in the world right now. And the world needs reasonable people of faith leading the way to create a more loving, just, and equitable world. And it all starts with this election. We need your help making sure that people like you, Texans of faith, listeners of this podcast, are participating. So let's take our responsibility seriously to reach out to our friends and bring them on this journey with us. The time to act is now. And with that, it's time to draw this episode to a close. If you've stayed with us this long, you must have enjoyed the content, so hope you'll share it with your friends and congregations and leave us a rating or review. That way, even more of your friends can find us and join in the movement for justice in Texas. Also, remember to keep an eye on Texas Impact social media for upcoming announcements, or email me at scott@texasimpact.org with questions. And remember, if you appreciate Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community, please make sure that you and your congregation are members of Texas Impact by going to texasimpact.org. Friends, these are wild times, and 2022 is an important year for democracy. More than ever, the world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnick, engineered and produced by David Vassallo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.